Welcome to a bonus episode of Literary Ramblings. I'm Joe, and today I want to spend some time with a novel that, for my money, deserves more attention than it typically receives. Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter. Before we get to the book itself, let's take a minute to learn about the author. Don Carpenter was born in Berkeley, California, and grew up in the Bay Area. Graduated from Berkeley High School, and in 1951 he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and was stationed in Kyoto, Japan, where he wrote for the Stars and Stripes and met a young Shel Silverstein. After his discharge in 1955, Carpenter returned to the West Coast, eventually settling in San Francisco with his wife and their two daughters. He earned an M.A. from San Francisco State College in 1961 and began teaching English before publishing his first novel, Hard Rain Falling, in 1966. This debut novel would go on to become his most enduring work, and in 2009, it was reissued by the New York Review of Books Classics series. Carpenter's career, however, stretched beyond literary fiction. From the late 1960s through the early 1980s, he moved in and out of Hollywood, writing screenplays and television scripts. He also wrote 3 novels set in Hollywood during that period, later collected as the Hollywood Trilogy. In 1984, Carpenter's close friend, the experimental counterculture writer Richard Brautigan, perhaps best known for the novella Trout Fishing in America, committed suicide. For Carpenter, this event marked the beginning of years of personal struggle with serious health problems, including tuberculosis, diabetes, and glaucoma. In 1995, after years of declining health, Carpenter too died by suicide. He was 64 years old. At the time of his death, he was working on a novel titled Fridays at Enrico's, which was later completed by Jonathan Lethem and published in 2014. Carpenter is also noted as the author of the line, quote, "Hello," end quote, "he lied," a darkly funny sentence that later became the title inspiration for multiple Hollywood memoirs. As already mentioned, Hard Rain Falling was published in 1966 and was Carpenter's first novel. It arrived during the very end of the Beat movement, a movement that focused on post-war realism, experimental prose, and the emerging counterculture. The Beats were often associated with either the East Coast or the West Coast literary scenes. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs were generally linked to the East Coast. In the New York scene, while Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Gary Snyder, and later counterculture writers like Ken Kesey and Richard Brautigan were connected with the West Coast. Carpenter, if he is to be considered a beat writer, which is arguable, would be classified with the West Coast crowd. Stylistically, however, his writing in Hard Rain Falling is far less psychedelic and much more stripped down and direct than something like Jack Kerouac's spontaneous prose, which was popular at the time. The novel itself follows Jack Levitt, an orphan boy growing up on the margins of Portland. Jack survives through instinct, existing in pool halls, cheap hotels, and on small hustles. Early in the novel, he forms a bond with the light-skinned black man Billy Lansing, a young pole hustler. Their friendship becomes one of the emotional centers of the book. Jack eventually lands in San Quentin and shares a cell with Billy. The two men become intimately involved and even claim to be in love. The novel tracks not just Jack's movement through institutions, but his attempts, often halting and often self-sabotaging, to construct a life after them. Billy dies in prison defending Jack after spending a lifetime facing racism and the limits placed on him due to his background. Jack will go on to marry a woman named Sally and father a child who he will name Billy in honor of his deep connection to Billy Lansing. Hard Rain Falling pushes against the easy arc. This isn't a clean redemption story, nor is it a straightforward crime prison novel. There's crime and there's prison, but the real subject is alienation and existential angst. Carpenter's world, set in the mid-20th century American West Coast, is not a glamorous California story, but a story focused on the colder underbelly of life: institutions, pool halls, bar rooms, and prison. The title itself feels both metaphorical and atmospheric. There's a steady downpour over this entire book, a sense that circumstances accumulate, that life beats down upon Jack and, in many ways, upon all the characters in the novel. In fact, upon closer examination of every developed character, no one is ultimately joyful. No one ends happy. Even the millionaire, Rolls-Royce driving Myron Bronson ends the novel unsettled and dissatisfied. When it was published, the novel received strong critical praise. Over time, though, Carpenter became one of those writers with an underground following rather than a mainstream presence, and he remains to this day not a widely canonized figure. Hard Rain Falling has, however, arguably developed into a minor American classic. One reason for this is likely because it feels psychologically correct in its portrayal of a young man shaped by abandonment in institutions, trying and often failing to live freely in a world that has already narrowed his options. One question that naturally comes up with Hard Rain Falling is whether the title is connected to Bob Dylan's 1963 song, A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall. Carpenter's novel was published in 1966, just 3 years after Dylan's song had already entered the counterculture. There's no public statement from Carpenter confirming that his title was influenced by or a reference to Dylan's song, so we can't say definitely that it's a direct reference. But it would be hard to imagine that the phrase, newly electrified by Dylan, wasn't somewhere in the air Carpenter was breathing. What's interesting to me, though, is how Carpenter interprets the phrase. Dylan's song catalogs visions of social and moral catastrophe, war, injustice, cultural decay. Carpenter's novel, on the other hand, seems a bit more inward-looking. The hard rain in Hard Rain Falling is the steady pressure of circumstance, the beating down we experience as we go through our lives. Regardless whether Carpenter consciously borrowed from Dylan or simply absorbed a phrase that had become culturally charged, both works carry a sense of inevitability, something falling hard, something that soaks through, something we can't quite escape. When I finished Hard Rain Falling, what stayed with me wasn't the crime in the pool halls and the prisons, although, full disclosure, I tend to gravitate toward gritty novels. It was the quiet realization that Jack is a man shaped almost entirely by institutions. At almost every defining moment of development, he's processed instead of parented. In fact, the book opens with a prologue that quickly summarizes the death of both Jack's mother and his father, neither of whom were capable of healthy parenting. Carpenter never mentions these parent figures again, and Jack never searches for who these people were. His early childhood memories are of living in an orphanage where he experienced unconsoled fear, relentless isolation, feelings of worthlessness, and the need to bury vulnerability. In fact, one of the most powerful examples of how institutionally destroyed Jack is comes when his wife Sally cruelly threatens to place their child in an orphanage. Just the thought of this traumatizes Jack and evokes crippling memories of his own institutionalized childhood. Carpenter never sermonizes about any of this. He doesn't turn the novel into a social statement, but the pattern is there. Jack is forced to bury his feelings, never show vulnerability, and instead to become streetwise, to learn to defend himself, to survive in the margins. What he never really learns, however, is how to trust, how to attach, how to imagine stability. Reading Hard Rain Falling in the 2020s, one is easily struck by how modern it feels. We still talk about young men drifting, about alienation, about male rage. Carpenter was writing in 1966, but the hard rain of the title feels familiar. And as I mentioned earlier, no one escapes the novel dry. There is no metaphorical umbrella. Sally never learns to love her child or to find satisfaction in her family, and quickly falls into her old pattern of burying her existential angst under hedonistic excitement. And the last we see of Myron Bronson is a vision of a sad, bored, wealthy man playing bridge with a fat, hairy dunce wearing a tiny bathing suit. Jack doesn't transform in some cinematic way either. He doesn't emerge purified. If there's growth in Jack, it is minor. Carpenter seems solely focused on how anyone can make it through this life of hard rain. Jack is certainly disadvantaged by circumstances, but Carpenter's decision to develop characters like Sally and Bronson indicate his intuition that life is existentially suffering regardless of circumstance. The experience of life is indeed the experience of hard rain falling. The novel feels morally serious. It doesn't excuse Jack or Sally or Billy or really any of the characters. It doesn't condemn them outright either. It simply reports, closely, unsentimentally. For a book often classified as crime fiction, what it really offers is something quieter and more unsettling, a study of how life can beat us down and how only truly loving relationships can offer any solace. Jack and Billy's relationship is complicated, tender, and ultimately heartbreaking, but at its core, it is meaningful and redemptive. Jack's early relationship with Sally is also initially redemptive. They both find temporary shelter from the hard rain, but it turns out not to be sustainable. Desire for more prevents Sally from settling into what seems like something Jack could be content with. As an aside, for a novel published in 1966, it's actually fascinating to see Billy and Jack's relationship treated with nuance and vulnerability. Jack and Billy's connection is undeniably real, substantial, in an attempt by two characters who have experienced a lot of hard rain to shelter, even temporarily, from the storm. Further, the hints around Sally's lesbian desires also feel remarkably modern, not a sensational plot device, but a genuine, understated aspect of her identity. Carpenter ultimately shows that desire for connection can override conventional heterosexuality. He reminds us that even in a world that feels relentlessly harsh, foster homes, prison cells, people hardened by circumstance, human desire for intimacy is ultimately all we have. So Carpenter's novel is ultimately about how we are ground down by the environment we endure, how we are all damaged, and how, for the lucky few of us, love can be solace, an umbrella in the storm. And maybe that's the quiet work of literature, not to pretend that the hard rain isn't falling, but to help us see what it's doing to us, and that human connection is perhaps our only hope. If you've been enjoying the content on Literary Ramblings, I encourage you to check out my novel, I Ain't a Girl, available now on Amazon in both ebook and paperback. It's a story I care deeply about, and one way to show your support for the show is by picking up a copy and leaving a review. And if you're in the Columbus area, join us for our special Literary Ramblings live event. We will be recording the podcast in front of a live audience, followed by a Q&A about I Ain't a Girl. The event takes place Monday, March 9th from 7 to 9 p.m. at Blue Couch Bookshop on Grandview Avenue. Come hang out, talk books, ask questions, and be part of the conversation. I'd love to see you there. We will be recording the podcast in front of a live audience, followed by a Q&A about I Ain't a Girl. The event takes place Monday, March 9th from 7 to 9 p.m. at Blue Couch Bookshop on Grandview Avenue. Come hang out, talk books, ask questions, and be part of the conversation. I'd love to see you there.